believes that they will not I love Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Again, the Russians have thrown Washington a lifeline to rescue Obama from his administration's catastrophic policies in Syria. After years of demanding forced regime change and watching the rise of the Islamic State, can the official groupthink in Washington finally accept defeat and embrace Putin's offer? To Crosstalk the Syrian conflict, I'm joined by my guest, Sami Ramadani in London. He is a contributor on Iraq and the Middle East for The Guardian, as well as a senior lecturer in sociology. Also in London, we have Abdelbari Atwan. He is an expert on political Islam and author of the book Islamic State, the Digital Caliphate. And in Clute, Texas, we cross to Daniel McAdams. He is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. And in fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Daniel, if I can go to you first in Clute, again, the Russians come to Obama's rescue. I mean, what are they going to call the film? Saving Private Obama? This is the second time we had with the sarin gas incident, which, you know, of course, it was the regime that did it. And of course, we know later that that was completely debunked. We're having the same thing happening again. Is there enough horse sense in Washington to change tracks and at least sit down and listen to the president of the Russian Federation?
Well, I think what happened is the U.S. administration panicked at first, and that's why a couple of weeks ago, first we saw this Ynet article claiming that there were thousands of troops on their way, Russian troops on their way to Syria, and it was a way, I think the administration was dealing with the panic that the sands were shifting underneath the feet of their foreign policy, and so you had all this panic, and you had this hilarious episode where Ambassador Samantha Power was cautioning the Russians on what would be a smart strategic move in Syria after 4 years of the U.S. Absolutely. I mean, who would take advice from someone like Samantha Power on what's a smart strategic move? So I think, and slowly it started sinking in, and that's why you saw John Kerry softening his position last week and suggesting that it might be possible for Assad to stay and to negotiate some sort of political settlement. So I think it's slowly dawning on them that they weren't getting the thousands of troops that they actually probably were hoping for, because then they could point their fingers at the Russians, but something very different is happening.
Sami, how do you see this here? Because obviously it's come to they've hit a brick wall in Washington. I mean, everything they've tried to do, not only is it a total waste of money and resources, almost everyone they've trained and funded have changed sides without working for the Islamic State or other terrorists and jihadist groups there. And now they have Vladimir Putin is saying, you know, if we can help you or we won't be with you, but we have policies and we're going to commit ourselves to it. Again, as I point out on this program, is that Russia is being invited to Syria, the legitimate government in Damascus, internationally recognized. It is the United States that is illegally bombing Syria against international law. So the Russians are coming, but in a very different way. Is this good or bad news in your mind? Sami, go ahead.
Well, I think the United States is probably, it's a probability now that the situation in Syria is so clear now that the opposition, the armed opposition, is two organizations primarily who control most of the territory outside of the Syrian government control. And these are ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the official Al-Qaeda organization in Syria. So you have two branches of Al-Qaeda practically forming the bulk of the armed opposition in Syria. So the United States has to come out and say, are they with the ISIS to continue the policy of regime change, or accept defeat and recognize the facts on the ground are that the terrorist organizations and the other armed groups they have been backing have now been reduced to mainly two organizations, both of which are extremist organizations. So they need to look the facts in the face. Unfortunately, the United States is famous for putting their foot in it and expanding wars and escalating in a way that creates even greater crises.
It's called doubling down. Abdel, if I can go to you here, I'd like to remind our viewers here that the two organizations, main organizations that Sammy just mentioned, they're all driving Humvees and using American munitions. Just like to point that out, okay? Abdel, I mean, now that we're watching Kerry and other members of the Obama administration eating their words right now, maybe Assad can stay a little while longer. Is this a cascade effect? I mean, we're seeing a complete collapse of policy. Go ahead, Abdel.
Oh, yes, definitely. I believe the American policies in the Middle East, it was a shamble, it was a chaos, and it failed completely to bear any fruits. In the beginning, they said the Assad regime is illegal and he should be toppled, his days are numbered. But the problem is they could not read between the lines and understand that what they are saying is nothing substantial. They had more than 4 years. I mean, the American administration and their allies in the Middle East, they had 4 full years. They were a sole player in Syria and Iraq. And they could not actually sort out the problem there. In the end, they came to Vladimir Putin saying, please save us. Now, the priority is the Islamic State and the Al-Nusra. How can we root them out? So I believe definitely this is a U-turn from United States and its ally in the Middle East, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other countries. So now I believe, Putin is trying to save them, and he is extremely serious and sending troops, sending materials, saying that Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria, and we have to cooperate with him if we want actually to fight the Islamic State. And it seems the American and their allies, European allies, Middle Eastern allies, they throw the towel saying to Mr. Putin, please do what you think is appropriate.
Daniel, one of the things I'd like to point out here is that, Vladimir Putin has come out very strongly recently because he's watched Obama flounder from one blunder after another when it comes to Syria for 4 long years now. But we have to remember it's in Russia's national interest as well. Russia's very close to Syria. I mean, you can drive a car, across land. It's not, like 2 huge oceans separating Russia from the Islamic State and other terrorist groups. And I want our viewers to know that it's very important for Russia's national security as well. There are thousands of former Soviet citizens, fighting apparently for the Islamic State. So this is, it's in Russia's national interest, and it's appealing to other people's national interests as well. When we look at this migration and refugee problem flooding into Europe, so it's about national interest. It's common sense. But are there enough people in Washington to listen to common sense? But for 4 years, they haven't.
Well, you make a good point, Peter. It's not that far from Grozny to Aleppo.
Yep.
It's certainly drivable. So Russia has an interest, and it has probably a huge concern of this instability spilling over into Russian territory. They've fought some bloody wars over Islamic extremists already, and I think they recognize a legitimate threat to their national security. The question of whether Washington gets it or not, I'm afraid Washington is at war with itself.
Oh.
We saw just this past week David Petraeus testifying before Congress, I believe it was, talking about how we need to establish no-fly zones, we need to get more rebels in there, essentially what he's been saying all along. Remember, David Petraeus gave us al-Qaeda twice.
Yeah.
The first in his great surge, which helped fund and create them, and the second time when his CIA under Obama decided to start covertly training rebels in Jordan and Turkey and elsewhere and sending them into Syria. These became al-Qaeda and ISIS. So here's a guy who gave us al-Qaeda twice, still being listened to by serious people in Washington. That just shows how insane things have gotten.
Yeah, Sammy, we've seen this movie a couple of times, and it always ends in tears. This is the thing this is the crux of this whole program, and what I keep thinking about and looking at what we're hearing. I mean, I look at the New York Times and the Washington Post. All they want is more regime change, not less. They want less. They want more illogic behavior, not in the national interest here. And this is why I'm convening all of us here, is because we've seen this happen repeatedly. It looks. I just really worry they're going to double down again, and they're just going to and not even look what could happen if there is a successful quote-unquote regime change in Damascus. Are they prepared for a black flag there? I don't know. What do you think, Sammy?
Well, they have 2 choices, Peter. Either they admit defeat or escalate. And I'm afraid escalation is also on the cards because the United States, as we know, in alliance with Israel, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on, has such deep roots, military, economic, let's not forget oil, strategic position, protection of Israel, and so on. And I fear that the United States has done it before historically. When they are in a corner, they don't normally admit defeat. They tend to escalate. So that is an equation that needs to be watched very carefully. From their behavior in Iraq as well today, you could see that they are trying to control the Baghdad government. They are trying to build more bases in Iraqi Kurdistan. And they need, if they are really genuine about controlling ISIS, which I fear they have been really drawing their borders rather than fighting them to finish them off. They need to tell Turkey to stop backing them. They need to tell the Saudis and Qataris to stop financing them.
Let me go to Abdel before we
so
go to the break here, because that's exactly what Vladimir Putin and Russia has been doing for the last few weeks. Talking to the Turks, talking to the Saudis, talking to the Israelis, trying to get some kind of diplomatic move here. Abdel, is it possible? I mean, because it seems like Washington's very afraid of diplomacy here. Go ahead.
I believe most of the regional and international powers are agreed on one thing, is ISIS is the most dangerous phenomena in the region now. So Putin is trying to convince everybody to change the priorities and to concentrate on ISIS as the major problem in the region. But the problem is, the American could not actually root out ISIS. More than 6,000 air sorties, and it did not work. So it seems now Putin's idea to actually set up some sort of alliance, broader alliance with regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Syria, Egypt, United States, Turkey, Europe, in order to fight ISIS. And it seems the only country which is willing to put boots on the ground is Russia.
We have to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with RT.
Russian disinformation.
Russian lying.
Information aggression.
This Russian propaganda has the potential to destabilize NATO members.
They're doing things against us, and they are winning.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war.
They're spending huge amounts of money putting out information that other people understand in other countries, and we're not.
The idea that there should be a network reaching people which does not repeat the U.S. propaganda system is intolerable.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
死体がこんなに埋もれているんです。そこのところをお母さんが子供の顔を見ても自分の子供だと気がつかない。
I, like most Americans growing up after the war, the bombs were a great thing. They ended the war, they saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides, and that's what my grandfather always said was his reason for the decision.
Truman was hoping for a dual strategy. One was to drop the bombs and hope that Japan would surrender. And number two, the Americans were trying to send a message to the Soviet Union.
There was American war planning in October of 1945 and had chosen 20 targets in Russia.
about sanctions.
Easy right or wrong, but I definitely think sanctions are better than conflict.
You don't perform for diplomatic reasons. You perform for humanitarian ways.
I'm talking obviously about Edward Snowden.
I believe he's a hero. I believe he's coming directly from his heart.
In 1960, Fidel Castro arrived in New York for a UN General Assembly session. The Cuban delegation stayed in Harlem Hotel, where Castro met many anti-establishment figures, journalists, and national leaders. On September the 26th, he delivered the longest speech in the General Assembly's history, criticizing the United States for imperialism and colonialism. 6 months later, not long after taking office, President John F. Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs invasion. The attack was a fiasco. Castro's victory consolidated his power in Cuba, and restoring diplomatic ties between the US and Cuba would take more than half a century.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the tragic Syrian civil war. Okay, Daniel, I'd like to go to you. It's being talked about in mainstream media that there could be a possible informal summit with Vladimir Putin and Barack Obama. It's pretty clear that Vladimir Putin basically despises Obama. He doesn't have any spine, and he doesn't trust him. What would a summit look like in your mind? I mean, I have some very interesting images that come to mind. Maybe like Obama with hat in hand. Go ahead. How would you see it, Daniel?
I couldn't help but get that funny photograph in my mind of Putin standing next to Lukashenko with, I think it was Poroshenko behind him back in the Ukraine crisis, when both of the two were looking at each other like, who's this dork behind us?
Well, no, I mean, it kind of looked like they were being marched along, you know, I mean, because Putin had a smile on his face, if you remember there. No, but, I mean, is there any use here right now? Because, I mean, one of the things that you've told our audience here on Crosstalk many times is that, you know, you have political appointees, and then you have the rest of the foreign policy establishment. On Syria, it looks like the political appointees are really being very, very ideological here. And the unfortunate thing from my perspective this far away is that Obama is not particularly interested, he's not engaged, and he more or less repeats talking points. In the issue of Ukraine and Russia, he obviously just reads 4 or 5 talking points, and that's all he knows. What's your read here? Go ahead, Daniel.
Well, he has been surrounded by people of a very ideological nature, whether left interventionists who will explain it to him in terms of humanitarianism, and that got us Libya, or the neocons like Petraeus, who explained it in terms of national security, and that gave us al-Qaeda in Syria. It is slightly disturbing when the most grown-up person in the room is John Kerry, who, as I pointed out earlier, really is responsible for the big shift in U.S. policy toward the suggested acceptance of Assad's role in any sort of political transition. So he's the grown-up in the room now.
Yeah, Sammy, it's interesting because Kerry was seen as the grown-up in the room when it came to Ukraine, and then he was suddenly shut out of the process because he was the only one that started speaking sense, and then other people like Victoria Nuland stole his wind here. But let's stay with Syria right here. Sammy, what is the region's perspective and people on the ground? Because, you know, Russia has, or the Soviet Union / Russia, a very long relationship with the Assad regime in Syria. It has maintained that relationship. Is Putin's words and promise to do something a breath of fresh air? It's a new actor, a new player that is actually very focused, because I'm not convinced the people in the State Department and the Pentagon see the Islamic State as the most dangerous opponent. They still think they're going to get every opportunity they have. They take out Assad, they will do it, and they continue to. I can't see them changing their mindset. What do you think, Sammy?
I think that last point you raised is very important. I think this agenda of regime change is still the primary impetus of U.S. policy in the region. And by regime change, it's not necessarily actually to overthrow a regime and bring a new one in, but they weaken states and regimes so much that they hope that these regimes will be more answerable to Washington. And I also, there should be a reminder here that ISIS is getting very strong in Yemen today. And the United States is backing the Saudi-led war against the Yemeni people. And you can see it on the ground now that the official Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen, as well as ISIS, are allied to the Saudis and the Americans in Yemen. So one has to look at this region as a totality and see that the United States' aggressive policies, pushing very hard to establish direct control or to overthrow regimes and regime change, I think for the foreseeable future, this is U.S. policy, despite the fact that they face serious setbacks. And I repeat, maybe something I always say on programs like this is that I repeat the Chinese saying that they lift a stone to drop it on their own 2 feet. And U.S. policy, no matter how many setbacks it suffers, it has this strategic impetus of aggression, of expansion, control of economical labor resources, and so on. And these are fundamentals that don't change very easily.
Yeah, but one of the fundamentals that really could change, if I go to Abdel in London, is that we do know that the defense secretaries in Russia and in the United States are talking to each other. The Israelis and the Russians are talking. Basically, if I can remind everyone, Syria is about the size of Oregon, the state of Washington, and it's not a big place. There's going to be a lot of drones and planes all flying around, and people are going to start bumping into each other here. Because I'm not convinced common sense will not rule in Washington. It rarely does. And I think the Russians are going to go after the Islamic State, but the Americans are going to continue to chaff away at Assad. And as Semi just pointed out, not necessarily destroying the regime, destroying the state, so there is no regime here. This is what's going to get complicated. These are new political facts that are worrisome. Go ahead, Abdel.
I believe, that the Russians are saying very important points here. They're saying, okay, listen, you could not actually root out the Islamic State. And you are destroying the infrastructure of Syria. You are actually destroying also the institutions of the regime itself. So you are repeating the same mistake in Iraq and Libya. So we cannot actually tolerate that forever. If you want to fight the Islamic State, okay, Assad, he did that in 1982 when he fought actually Muslim Brotherhoods when they revolted against the regime, and he managed to root them out. So he has a huge experience in this field. So Putin saying, okay, Assad should be incorporated in this fight against ISIS if it is the most dangerous threat to the region and also to the international community. So the Israelis are extremely worried because what will happen if, for example, if the Israeli warplane actually was going to be shot down by the Russian missiles here, because the Russian now, they will have full control about 2 air bases near Latakia, and also they have a naval bases in Tartus. So it will be very congested airspace, very congested area. So in this case, you have to say to the Israeli, look, you cannot actually continue your raids inside Syrian territories as you used to do in the past. Now we are in control. We are in the control of the space. We are in the control of the grounds. We are going to concentrate on one enemy, which is the Islamic State. So stay away, please. It is not your role anymore. You don't have any role anymore when it comes to Syria. So I believe that the message from Putin is very clear to the Israelis, to the American. Look, it is getting serious now, and we have to do the job, and we have to do it according our own experience in several parts of the world. So that's how it is written in the wall, and I see it that way.
Daniel, but the nefarious forces could actually take advantage, if I could use that term, of this situation here and want to have the Russians and the Israelis or the Russians and the Americans cross wires here. This worries me, a false flag here, because when I look at these people that that started all this mess all through the Middle East, all during this century here. The worse, the better. The more chaos, the better. I mean, that's what they do. They try to manage chaos. They try to manipulate different forces. One rises up, one falls down. You move this border over here, you move that border over there. As long as you keep churning it up, okay? The Russians showing up, we're going to say no more of that. I'm worried about this. Are you?
You can almost imagine all the Beltway think tanks writing endless papers about how if we can draw the Russians in, we can have a new Afghanistan for them and bring down the Putin regime. I'm sure that plays into it. But I'd like to point out the other thing that hasn't come up, which is that there are really two U.S. wars against Syria taking place. And I sense a real shift in the media narrative here in the U.S. As you know, the media is much more compliant here to the regime than the government would like to admit. On the one hand, you have the DoD training of the rebels. These are vetted rebels. It's completely universally accepted that it's a disaster. They say 4 or 5 fighters exist now that have been trained and vetted. But don't forget, starting in, 2012, the CIA started its own program.
Right.
They trained at least 10,000. They spend $1 billion a year. 1/15 of their entire budget they've spent training unvetted rebels, i.e. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, to go in to Syria. So what's happening is that the U.S. is sort of admitting that the DoD program's a failure, so nobody will look over here and see this enormous successful program that brought in ISIS. And this is what I think they're trying to disengage, because when the truth comes out how horrible U.S. policy has been, I think it's going to really reverberate.
Okay, Dan, I want to finish this point here. What happened to at least 10,000 of those guys that were trained? What happened to them? They went on the other side. They went to the other side. They just jumped ship.
To ISIS.
Yeah. Sammy, go ahead, jump in. I mean,
they were already there. I think they were already there.
I think a lot of these fighters that came through Turkey, and as you referred earlier, tens of thousands of them from across the world, they ended up being recruited by ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra primarily. So really, they didn't just disappear. They actually beefed up the forces of ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. And these beefed up forces of ISIS eventually took over Mosul in alliance with some Iraqi forces. So you could see that the United States must be aware of all that. One has to also remember the Defense Intelligence Agency top secret report that was revealed recently in 2012. That report was saying that there will be an Islamic State, and the United States and the West concur with that eventuality. So really their policy on the ground was to support and back these terrorist organizations, and sometimes they grow bigger than what the United States wants. So they go and bomb them so that they could control them.
Gentlemen,
while
we're going to see where this goes. We'll see. We've run out of time. We'll see where the Russian peace initiative will go. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Clute. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules. I love you.